Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Gennardi-Canan. I'm the head of communications at 97%, and I'll be moderating this panel on how the media covers guns. How the media frames the issue of gun violence has a tremendous impact on how Americans perceive it, affecting their views on root causes, solutions, prevalence, and more. An integral part of our mission at 97% is to change the conversation around gun safety. And joining us today are two journalists doing just that. Gutowski is the founder of The Reload, a publication devoted entirely to gun policy, politics, and the underreported aspects of gun ownership in the US. Abené Clayton is the lead reporter of The Guardian's Guns and Lies in America series, where she investigates everyday gun deaths in Black and Brown communities. She puts names, faces, and experiences to victims, survivors, and those trying to help. Both were recently hired by CNN to offer their reporting and analysis for the network's new Guns in America's beat. Welcome, Stephen and Abené. And we will get things started with the impetus for The Reload and the Guardian's Gun and Lies series. Why were they created, and sort of how are you guys filling voids in current coverage? And maybe we'll start with Stephen.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. And The Reload was created because I saw a gap in coverage specifically surrounding guns and politics and culture in the United States. When you look at, for instance, major media, there tends to be a lack of knowledge about firearms and gun owners that really is very noticeable, I think, to a lot of gun owners across the country. And they know the politics side fairly well. They know what's going on Capitol Hill. They can follow a bill much better than I can in a lot of major media outlets, but they don't know the guns very well. And then on the other side, you have a lot of gun media, which knows firearms very well. They could tell you the muzzle velocity of, a 5.56 round or, a 308 or what have you, but there's not as much good reporting from gun media on the politics aspect of the issue. They don't know as much about what happens on Capitol Hill. And so that was an area where I had an advantage personally, being somebody who was a beat reporter at the Washington Free Beacon for many years, covering this issue. And The Reload was created to fill that gap in our media landscape.
Thank you. And Abené, do you want to talk about kind of what you think you're doing unique at sort of the series on a whole and your specific role there?
Yeah, of course. So the Guns and Lies in America series was started in 2019. And at the time, it was meant to serve a couple different purposes. One was to broaden the conversation around gun deaths. A lot of the focus on shootings was around high profile mass shootings that we see in schools, malls, those sorts of places, and not as much focus at the national level was paid to what constitutes the second highest amount of gun deaths, which is homicides, usually the ones that happen in inner city neighborhoods, mostly impacting Black and Brown low income families. There just wasn't a lot of space at the time in the national media landscape to talk about the implications, have some accountability stories, and like you mentioned in the introduction, to put names, faces, and experiences to what is largely seen as a crime problem. Another purpose was to kind of demystify what happens in what I still refer to it as like hoods across America. And I say that with love. It's a place that I'm from, a hood that brought me to where I am today in Richmond, California. So to tell stories that show the people who live in the places where gun violence is most prevalent as the people who are also trying to address, heal, and make sure that, children and parents don't deal with these losses. And those stories weren't being told either. There was this kind of assumption that the people who live in communities where these things happen most are either apathetic or completely complicit to gun violence, and that is just not the case. So that was the impetus of the Gun Violence Project. At the time, there was a really substantial drop in gun homicides in the Bay Area. So I was just kind of, reflecting on, we started out talking about the solutions, what people are doing, kind of putting different names and faces on gun violence prevention efforts. And the past 2 years have been me charting this really unfortunate increase in homicides that have been concentrated in the same communities they always were. So the role of the project has evolved, but has really stayed true to those two main tenets of expanding beyond high profile mass shootings and putting names and faces to the people who experience this the most.
I think you both have touched on it in part, but could you both kind of speak to what you think the media is doing wrong presently and maybe give specific examples?
Sure. I can go first if you want. For me, I think a lot of the issue stems from ignorance or lack of knowledge when it comes to firearms, how they work, why people own them, what the laws currently are, what proposals would do in Congress and elsewhere. I think that's a much bigger problem than even something like political bias, which you hear talked about far more often, obviously. And while I believe that exists to some degree, given how most media is concentrated in more liberal areas, and reporters tend to oftentimes think the same way on a lot of political issues. I think the bigger problem is lack of expertise on the topic. And what you'll commonly see, and a big part of this problem is the focus on mass shootings, because and specifically very high profile mass shootings, which don't occur every day necessarily. Something like Uvalde is not happening every day. And so you'll often have general assignment reporters assigned to cover these events, and those are the only times they ever really talk about firearms or firearm policy. And that leads to a lot of common mistakes throughout the media ecosystem when it comes to covering firearms in America. And I think that there's plenty of examples of this. Certainly specific examples would be things like repeating misleading labels, like for instance, the gun show loophole sort of implies that there is a loophole that exists for specifically gun shows that make them distinct from any other place a gun happens to be sold. And while that label is used to describe a real political issue with universal background checks and how the system currently works for regulating commercial sales versus private sales, it misleads people as to what the issue is. But even far more common base level information is commonly just something that reporters don't get right. Things like the difference between semi-automatic and fully automatic is you see that mistake made all of the time, and the implications for reporting based off of not having even a very base level understanding of how guns work are immense. And I think it does a lot to take away credibility from the industry. And it's something that I've always tried to work at improving as much as I can as one person, right? By helping other reporters from major outlets, who I do believe the vast majority of your beat reporters are trying to get their stories right. They don't want to mislead their audiences, but they just run into this lack of information in the industry generally. And so one thing I try to do is give advice on stories to any reporters who reach out for that sort of consultation. And off the record, it's something that I'm happy to continue to do, and it's something that I think CNN has embraced with this new effort to focus on the issue as not just something that pops up every once in a while when a mass shooting comes along, but get people from a number of different perspectives, to reporters in the industry from a number of different points of view to come in and cover the issue more comprehensively. And I hope that's something that the rest of the industry, buys into as well.
And Abené, what about your thoughts on kind of what might be, for instance, the series is Guns and Lies. In part, I would assume the media might be perpetuating some of these lies, or what would you say is kind of maybe a fault of how the media is covering guns at the present moment?
Yeah, I think one of the most glaring ones for us was the the focus on, as we've said a couple of times, high profile mass shootings, and the conversation really would lead someone from outside of the nation to think that horrible things like Stephen mentioned, Uvalde, are happening every day, or that is where our largest gun violence burden is, just because it takes up most of the media landscape and the national conversation about guns and violence. And I will say, over the past, 2 or 3 years, that has evolved. When I first started, there was a hesitancy to even call, multiple people being shot at like a house party, or somewhere in one of my hoods across America, multiple people are shot, and it wasn't called a mass shooting. It's called a gang shooting. It was a turf war. It was all of these qualifications that really didn't make a lot of sense from like a journalistic perspective. And in the past to me at least, and in the past couple of years, I think there's been more of an acceptance of using kind of a numerical standard. There's still some conversation. I personally go by, 4 people shot, killed or injured, excluding the mass shooter. And I don't really make any delineations, I guess, based on whether it happened in a home, whether it happened on a city block, whether it happened in a public place. So I think there's this kind of still prioritization of location and frankly, the race of the victims oftentimes that leads to it either being a crime story or a conversation about guns, the issue of gun violence in America, this ubiquity of guns being available to people who may not need to have them, So I think that is one mistake, that it happens less frequently. And I will say I've seen, mass shooting coverage or high profile mass shooting coverage, unfortunately, feels like a clock at this point. It's like the same kind of cycle, it feels. And before, there wasn't, much space carved out before, the kind of news cycle moved on. And, unfortunately, it starts over again. Now there's a little bit of time, I call it at like 11:45, right before the clock resets, where we're like, oh, wait, gun violence and these situations happen to people every single day. Here's, a violence intervention program. Here are some moms. So now there's a little slot there, but I just think that some reporters, local, national, et cetera, may not see, they may look for that news peg, right? There may need to be like a big moment to talk about what's going on. And I think that's a really grave mistake, that these conversations about it's a budget story, it's a school education story, it's a public health story. So I feel like it's often left out. It's either high profile mass shootings or crime wave are really the only times, unfortunately, that you see gun violence. And if those are, the only 2 contexts that it's coming up, then you're missing out on a lot of policy, a lot of stories about police work and things that are really valuable to the entire nation, and aren't as hyper local as crime reporting may make these issues feel.
It's certainly something we see all the time as we're trying to reach out to people with research that we have and such, and the interest builds as soon as there's a tragedy, and it's really hard to get attention otherwise. Wanted to ask you guys about if there's an example of a story that might have gone unnoticed or not reported or reported incorrectly had you not covered it. And I'm thinking particularly, Abené, of the, I think you labeled it as the unspoken epidemic, and the focus you put on that. And that might be an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the unspoken epidemic was how a nurse who started a group called Black Femicide that told the stories and put out the stories of women who were, Black women particularly, who had been killed via homicide. And we ended up doing kind of an entire series about this, the increase in homicides in 2020 was reported on very thoroughly, and the racial kind of disparities within it were talked about, a little less widely, but were certainly a part of the coverage. And my colleague, Lois Beckett, and I were just kind of going over FBI data now that we had some solid, resources. And we found that Black women had the second highest increase in homicides. We know that unfortunately, Black men, especially young Black men, are most at risk of dying from a gun homicide. But right below that risk was Black women, and nobody was really talking about it. There were some niche groups there, and most of them were killed with guns. Many of them knew the person who killed them. So but that wasn't a part of our, oh my gosh, 2020 homicides have gone up exponentially. It's the biggest increase, biggest single year increase since the 1960s. The conversation around, the intersections of race and gender just weren't happening. And so we decided to kind of start a series, just kind of breaking that number down, how it impacts families. And we have some follow-up reporting coming out of a couple states, including Iowa, which have returned some really interesting and heartbreaking numbers just about not only the disparities, but then the kind of lack of responsiveness that parents, that children see after their mother, aunt, cousin, sister has been killed. And it's something that I still don't think we necessarily talk about enough. And part of it's understandable because that risk for young Black and Latino men and boys is just so high. But I think we do ourselves a real disservice to conversations about equality when we leave out a very blatant and clear disparity among Black women. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Actually, there's so many stories that I'm like, oh, this got underreported. And unfortunately, you do so many of these stories and they're so sad, but you kind of end up moving on. But yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that one because it's something that I still haven't seen a lot of coverage on, but people will refer to in Twitter arguments. And I'm always like a little happy when people are like, well, Black women, this isn't happening to them. The risk is this, that. And someone will put Lois and I's story in there as a fact check. And that always feels kind of nice. So thank you.
Yes, very important to elevate that work. And Stephen, what about you? Is there something, a particular story or multiple that you can think of that maybe would have gone underreported or reported incorrectly had you not tackled it?
Yeah, certainly. I think that actually going in the same vein here, media coverage, as we've been talking about, tends to focus exclusively on mass shootings when it comes to talking about firearms. And that leaves out a lot of the other types of gun violence that exist, as Abené has talked about there and covered extensively. But it also leaves out other uses of firearms besides the criminal use, which, I mean, obviously in a country where 46% of people report having a gun in the home, according to the Associated Press, there's a lot of non-criminal use of firearms. The default use of firearms is non-criminal. There's a lot of ways that people use guns for all sorts of things. Obviously self-defense is a top reason why people buy guns, but you have all sorts of other uses for firearms, including hunting and sport shooting as well. And, I would say that the media does a pretty poor job of looking into why people own firearms, to try and to better understand that. And the stereotype or the coverage implies that guns are only used for violence, especially when you're talking about demographics like young Black men. And that's an area where I've profiled, for instance, Guns Out TV, which is a show run by John Keyes and Shermichael Singleton, that explores gun ownership, generally, but also from the point of view as the fact that they're Black men. And there's been the rise of all sorts of minority gun owners over the last several years that I've reported extensively on as well. Groups like Asian American Pacific Islander Gun Owners Gun Association. There's also the National African American Gun Association, and the sort of diversification of gun ownership, the increasing diversification of gun ownership in America, especially since 2020, is a huge story that I will say the media has done some reporting on, some really good reporting on it at other major outlets, but it's something that we've definitely focused a great deal on at the Reload, because I think it really changes how the conversation about guns in America moves forward and what the politics of guns in America are going to be as minority gun owners grow as a percentage of overall gun ownership in the United States. I think it has huge implications for the culture, but also for national, state, and local politics surrounding firearms. So it's something that we've definitely focused on extensively. And then obviously, another area that maybe surprises people more would be my reporting on the NRA. Not in that I'm reporting on them, but that I'm often the only one reporting on them, even even in the last few years when they've had this incredible internal turmoil, and they are the largest gun group in the country, the most influential one, the one with the most money, the most members. And yet I will oftentimes be the only reporter who goes to their board meetings or to their members' meetings. And I think that's something that might surprise a lot of people, that you don't see more New York Times or Washington Post or NBC reporters at those sorts of more mundane happenings at the NRA, or even fairly significant ones. I was one of the only reporters at the 2019 board meeting after Wayne LaPierre was accused of corruption, and there was the president left dramatically during the event. And so, even though there is good reporting, again, from other major outlets, including the ones I named on the NRA, there's often a lack of specific focus that goes beyond just a few key events here or there that really gets left to almost nobody covering. I mean, if I wasn't at some of these meetings, literally no one would cover it.
Yeah. Okay, well, to sort of our last question, how do you think you can improve, or how can we as a whole improve coverage of gun violence, which obviously we know the unique work you guys are doing at your individual outlets, but maybe how do you hope to do so via your new roles at CNN?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, one of the things I'm really excited for, or feel like there's a really great opportunity to do, is hear from, or at least relay what people who have had kids killed, who have had loved ones killed, are actually saying about things like, police funding, police on school campuses, and all of these political lightning rods that come up and are discussed after a high profile incident, whether it's a mass shooting, a child being slammed to the ground or something like that. All of these conversations kind of pop up. And I feel like reporters and people well-intentioned, and like Stephen said, a lot of them / us, I'm in LA. So, we're definitely in some of these big coastal cities. And so I think we end up assuming what victims and people who have lost loved ones want and feel, and what their political stances are. And it's so broad, complex, and difficult to kind of sort through, that I really relish the opportunity to present directly, here's someone whose son was killed, when they were 18, and this is what they have to say about this controversial topic. Y'all don't have to speak for this person anymore, So I think that's one of the most exciting things to do, to relay those messages from people that I've been hearing from, who have been frustrated and hurt for years. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would think to expand on that as well, just bringing more nuance to the conversation overall would be very valuable, I think, for CNN and for the media coverage of this issue generally, because I mean, there's just so many different points of view all throughout America on owning guns generally, and then among people who do own them. There's a wide variety of views. There's just so much more to discuss about guns in America than whether or not you support universal background checks and assault weapon ban, or national reciprocity. These have been the conversations been kind of stuck in this one simplistic place for 30 years, and it just hasn't, especially in major media, moved beyond that at all very much. And I think what I'm looking forward to with the CNN initiative that we're part of is just bringing more light than heat, bringing more nuance, bringing more information to people, and getting away from just your typical three-person talking head debate on cable news that's got the same talking points on either side, and they just repeat them at each other every time a mass shooting happens. I hope we can get to something that is much more comprehensive than that covers all kinds of different stories from all kinds of different points of view with all kinds of different people involved.
Yes, well, I'm excited that we have that ahead from you guys. Excited to get you two on a Zoom together. I don't think you've actually met. So very excited for what's to come from you. Thank you so much for being generous with your time, Thanks for what you do. Also, to those of you who want to hear anything more from Stephen and Abené, we have interviewed both of them on our Talking About Guns series and podcast, so you should check that out. And then get excited for the next panel. So thank you very much and stick around.